Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics, where we take the best and the brightest of the books that you've always wanted to read and break it down for you, do the heavy lifting, pretty much make Tony do it, and then I just take the credit for it and make very cheesy jokes. So we're in the midst of Nancy Pearcey's book, Finding Truth, 5 Principles for Unmasking Atheism, Secularism, and Other God Substitutes. Right. And so what she's doing in this book is laid out kind of on this page where she says she's trying to find a single line of inquiry that we can apply universally to all ideals. Mm. And so instead of having an exhaustive knowledge of every ism and oddity and any possible
where we would
thing
have
that could
and then a comeback for each individual
right.
ism or whatever.
And for every critique that people have on, no, I don't adhere to that one. I am B prime version of it. Okay. So what she's identified is through the argumentation that Paul gives in Romans 1, that she's identified these 5 principles that we're utilizing to critique a worldview or to give an answer to a worldview. And obviously we want to compare it, contrast it with what the Christian worldview offers.
Right. So she's suggesting that these 5 principles then can apply to any worldview, any past worldview, existing worldview, even when new ones come out. Yeah. This particular line of reasoning then can allow us then to deal with any worldview.
Right. So just remember 5 things instead of all the hundreds of different worldviews that are out there. So far we've looked at the first principle is identify the idol. That's very important. Mm-hmm. Anything that's not the biblical Christian God. An idol is set up in God's place, as Romans 1 says. And so, of course, you always have to define your terms first. And so here you have the identification, very important. Then once something has replaced God, obviously it's going to be a reduced view of the supreme Godhead. And within its frame of scope, it's going to pull something from creation, which is going to be less than what the Bible says, what God reveals to us is a reduction of humanity. Right. There's a lot of things that it can reduce, but if we focus on just where humanistically speaking, it reduces humanity, then it's easier to kind of identify and critique.
Right. So the idol is whatever the person's ultimate reality is. It might be materialism. It might be, rationalism, whatever that person holds as the right. final authority and ultimate reality. But all of those things are part of creation, and therefore that idol then is less than the true and the living God. And so they have to reduce their view of the way, especially the way people are. Right. Right. Yep. Is what she's getting at here. Yep. Right?
And so we've covered a little bit of those areas in previous episodes, and currently we're in the midst of principle number 3, which is to test the idol. Does it contradict what we know about the world? So there are kind of 2 major critiques of things. Whether they can be consistent internally within itself, and then we'll look at that in the next chapter. But then what she does first after finding the reduction is then say, what else does it say about the world that we can observe and agree on, and where is it falling short from making those? And we've started actually to look at a few people, a few very, very honest philosophers, authors, people that speak about this in general, and pretty much they've reduced humanity to robots, slaves, unthinking, just going through the motions, unable to make choices. And so essentially that's where we're at right now, and we're going to look at a few more very important people within the world of this kind of understanding of a different perspective of what if God doesn't exist, what does humanity really boil down to? What is our purpose? We started this chapter looking at a woman teaching her children or her child that she's insignificant in this world, and that what she does really doesn't amount to anything, which is very, very hearty. The participation trophies, I think, are even more meaningless in that one.
Yeah. So does the worldview contradict what we know about the world?
Right.
That's this particular principle here, and she's trying to show that if indeed you can't live with your worldview because it doesn't allow us to live in the world that God has created, then clearly something is wrong with it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. There's a lot of it appears like we have free will, but I know we don't. But I'm not going to address that, or
I will address it,
yeah.
and I'll say that free will is just an illusion, but we can't live without it.
Right. Yeah. Yep. And so what we're going to dig into is again very prominent people talking in detail about what their system offers us to look at. Again, they've replaced God with humanity or some lesser version of God, and so that's where we're at right now. So Professor Pearcey says that an effective strategy in apologetics is to help people see more clearly where their worldview leads. When they realize their idol-centered worldview fails the practical test, that insight may open them to the case for a biblical worldview. And again, that's always going to the point. We're not rubbing in people's faces. We're not putting the thumb in their eye. We're not doing various things with our hands in people's faces. There's no gotchas. Our whole purpose is to replace their worldview with the more superior one that explains and takes the part that they have, which may not always be fully incorrect, but it doesn't speak to the broad picture at hand, because they have to say, well, it appears this way, but it can't be. Right. And so we're kind of able to take all those points and make the some of the parts whole.
Right. So what we're really doing is clarifying for them what they believe and the implications of it,
right.
in hopes that they'll see how that doesn't work, right? And therefore they'll be more inclined to accept and be persuaded, as Paul says, persuaded to accept the true and the living God and the Christian worldview.
Yeah. So the examples that she brings up are people who are very clear on their stance of, this is what I view of humanity, and here seems to be the problems that arise. For example, Marvin Minsky from MIT, he's well known for the saying that the human brain is nothing but a 3-pound computer made of meat. And obviously, since computers do not have the power of choice, the implication is that neither do humans. And then, surprisingly, Minsky then asks, does that mean we must embrace the modern scientific view and put aside the ancient myth of voluntary choice? Well, it seems so, right? I mean, computers, that's all we are, and computers don't make choices, so voluntary choice is a myth, right? And we should shirk it away and just live with the fact that we don't have voluntary choice. Well, no, we cannot do that, is what he says. Why not? He goes on to say that no matter that the physical world provides no room for the freedom of will, absolutely none, even though it appears that way, that concept is essential to our models of the mental realm. Again, doing this dichotomy of a lower room and an upper room. The things that aren't real get put up in the attic. That's right. and outside the box, outside the scope of needing to explain. We cannot give it up. We're virtually forced. And again, Professor Pearcey says here are the big key words to identify when someone is idle talking, not idle talking, but idol talking. That we're virtually forced to maintain that belief, even though we know it's false. That it is, according to Minsky's materialistic worldview. So again, this is this doublethink that is clearly being established here. He is not referring to merely cultural customs or traditions that can differ from society to society. These are truths that humans cannot not know. So it's things that we know. We hold people accountable for their actions. It's why the law courts exist. It's why we tell our children not to do something. There's a myriad of cultural and civil and just moral claims that we make on people that is a signal for voluntary choice. Trying to convince somebody of something, that a debate to have, is all signals of voluntary free choice. And so here he's moves to the upper story. So in his
so we could ask Minsky, and again, this is moving into the next chapter. But so if everything is that we do is just part of the deterministic deal, then if you're determined to do this, then why should I? If you're determined to say what you say, then why should I pay any attention to it?
Right? Yeah. It's
just your determinism that's allowing you to say this, and so maybe I have a different determinism, and that's why I believe the way I believe. So
again, just computers are made of meat. That's our brain, but then this freedom of will that we seem to experience, that's all outside the box. That's on top. And clearly that's all fake, even though it seems we cannot do otherwise. They take a leap of faith and put it in the upper story. This is a far cry from the biblical concept of faith, but here is she's talking about a different leap of faith. So when we walk by faith, not by sight, some Christians seem to think that that Paul is speaking metaphorically, and by faith it means not reason. But Paul is speaking literally here. He means sight when he says sight. Non-material realities are invisible. They cannot be seen. Faith is the evidence of things not seen. And so it's one thing to see the resurrection of Jesus, right? If you see a dead person put alive, that's something that you could say, okay, I don't need faith to see that because I saw that happen. Obviously, we're removed from that historical sense, so even there we have to remain faith. But when Jesus then says, "I was raised from the dead because I'm here to pay for your sins," well, there's no scientific testing of that. You can't petri dish it. You can't titrate it. That's the type of faith here. But when secularists kind of project themselves into this faith mode, there's literally nothing for them to leap into because they don't embrace anything.
That's right.
The secular project leads to the suicide of the intellect and the disintegration of the person. By contrast, the Christian worldview is amazingly positive, affirming both the unity of truth and the holistic commitment of the thinking person.
Yeah, good. So the next section is she's entitled Atheism versus Civilization.
Dun, dun, dun.
And she says in Romans 1, Paul warns that idols lead to destructive behavior, right? To moral and social breakdown.
I mean, just think about what we've talked about so far. You're nothing but meat. You have no. You're nothing but stardust. You're essentially a slave. What actions will come from teaching people that, believing that? I mean, clearly there are implications. Your belief system isn't divorced from your action system.
Yeah. If I don't believe that there's a wall in front of me, right, and I've given this illustration before, and I take off running, right, my belief system is going to have a drastic effect on my nose.
Yeah.
Right. So she says that amazingly, some secular thinkers recognize Paul's warning, and she quotes here philosopher Saul Smolinski. He's a determinist who regards free agency as an illusion, right? Yet he considers it a fortunate illusion because it makes, notice, civilized life possible.
I mean, that's not just, you happen to have a blind spot in your eye and nothing's really happened. Just all of civilization rests on the fact that we have this fortunate illusion.
Right. And so he urges society's elites to persuade people that they are responsible agents in order to maintain a healthy sense of moral duty and responsibility.
So he can believe that free will is an illusion. That's fine. And he can write
books.
And
he can know that that's the case.
He is the most dangerous person in society. He is letting out the secret. Yeah. But he should be locked in a cave.
That's right. He's the one that's unpersuaded, right?
Man. Yeah.
Yeah. And so Smolinski here, she says, summarizes by saying, we cannot live adequately with a complete awareness of the absence of free will. Thus, we ought to hold on to those central but incoherent or contradictory beliefs in the free will case, right? And so she makes the point. What are the telltale phrases that is challenging general revelation? In other words, what the world is really like. What are those phrases? Well, his admission, she says, that we cannot live on the basis of what his worldview teaches, that we ought to hold on to a contradictory belief in free will.
Ooh, oughts. Yeah. Those nasty ought words.
Yeah, really. So, his materialistic worldview then gives him no basis for any moral ought, as you're mentioning here, right? Because that word implies that humans are capable of making moral choices when he's already said we're not able to do that. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's so a review of his book points out that he is an advocate of as she has been saying, a two-tier system. Right? There are those in the know, mostly philosophers and scientists, who know what's going on, right? Who are, as you mentioned, probably based on what he's saying, the most dangerous people in the world.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
And then there's the rest of us, right? Who are
the plebes?
That's right. The bumbling, stumbling,
the dirt eaters. Yeah, and again, nothing new under the sun. This is what Gnosticism was. The secret things that they were to reveal, and they, if you were a Gnostic, you were kind of judged by what leader you adhered to, and granted, most of those leaders all died out because of if you have a secret group, if you let everybody in, it's not the best thing in the world. It's
not secret anymore.
Yeah, but it never led to the downfall of Western civilization here.
So she tells us that when we hear people talk about ideas that are false yet necessary for humane social order, that's a signal that they have bumped up against the hard edge of reality that does not fit their worldview.
Tony's wall.
That's the wall that smashes the nose, right?
Yeah.
They have stumbled upon the truths of general revelation, the way God has really, created the world, basically. And they're seeking to suppress those truths by demoting them to useful fictions. In other words, putting them up in the second story or the second part of the box, or sticking out of the box, right? That sort of thing. And she says it's remarkable how Paul's description in Romans 1 of the dynamics of suppression makes sense of the latest modern worldviews. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Then comes our good friend Richard Dawkins, and how does the master of New Atheism himself deal with this kind of worldview?
Right, and we should point out here that she's doing something very important here. She's just not making claims; she is documenting what real people say and believe about their own worldview. Yeah. Right, real people and smart people, we would suggest, even right. She's documenting that. Because she's just not, these are not ad hominem or attacking, false attacks.
Let them speak for themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Dawkins says that humans are merely, and again, merely should be a key word there, survival machines. They're robot vehicles blindly programmed by their genes. We're just slaves to our genes. The selfish gene that he's written. Different memes and his blind watchmaker. The books that he's written all point to this. We're just in modes of survival, and our genes push us along, and we don't really have any way to make choice.
Yeah, and so again, we need to ask Dawkins the question. So are you programmed to say that? Are you programmed to believe that? And if so, why should we pay attention to it? How do we know it's true or false, right?
Right. So I think that illustrates a really good point, is that these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points, principles can flow and you can interchange them, and it's not a roadmap. It's main points to hit on, because it seems like here you're giving them the implications of, okay, well, this is what you see out in the world. Well, then what are your actions that govern you when you kiss your children goodnight? But also, if you're saying that's the case, then here are the implications based on your worldview. So why should I listen to you and not to my genes. My genes tell me that God exists. So therefore God does exist, right? It helps me with my survival. So, it's not just, okay, well, we're in principle 3 now. We got to wait for a few more interactions back and forth. Now principle 4, and now we can present the gospel. These things can interchange, but she's highlighting these points. So in Dawkins' mind, a person has no more freedom than a little red car. However, when pressed on the issue after a lecture, Dawkins admitted that he does not practice what he preaches. Well, that's weird. Yeah. He does not treat the very idea. Exactly. He does not treat the very idea of responsibility as nonsense. He does not hold people responsible, or he does hold people responsible for their actions. I blame people. I give people credit, is what he says. But don't you see that's an inconsistency in your worldview? Is the response? And Dawkins replies, I sort of do, yes, but it is an inconsistency that we sort of have to live with. Otherwise, life would be intolerable. So you don't have the ability to freely choose, but if you chose to act that way, you'd be intolerable. Yeah. Right. So again,
if everybody chose to act that way, he says life is intolerable.
Right? I can choose to act like this, but not everybody else.
That's right.
So again, it's a signal of when people are unable to live within their scope of their worldview. It would be the same thing as if everyone believed that 2 + 2 = 5, and we kept shooting our rocket towards Mars and it kept veering right. At some point we have to say, okay, maybe we need to reestablish what our basic assumptions are of arithmetic, and say maybe we've gotten something wrong. And that's even a poor illustration, because with that you can check arithmetic itself. But what we're saying,
well, you can check it against the way the world is and the way math works and that sort of thing. And that's really what we're saying here, right? Check it against the world.
Here is their basic belief system, and this is again, almost, I don't want to say dangerous, but you're causing people to convince them to upturn their most basic belief system. And Romans 1 tells us that
that leads to disastrous behavior.
You will worship something. And so they'll either move on to the next idol, which then again you'll just go through this process again, or they're forced to confront the fact that they live in God's world and they're subject to God's being a creature of God. And there are implications that Paul talks about from believing these things, and it's a whole lifestyle that people would have to uproot and change if they adhered to these. If they logically went through with a consistent viewing of their worldview.
Right. Yeah.
So it's dangerous, in both ways.
Yeah. So God, Romans 1 says, gives them over, allows them to go to the end, allows them to smash their nose against the wall. Okay. Right?
How could God do such a thing?
In hopes that they'll come to themselves like the prodigal son did, right? And realize that, oh, wait a minute, there is a wall there, right? Her next section, she picks on Einstein.
Well, you can't do that.
Yeah. Einstein's dilemma, she says. She says, what we learn from these examples is that many prominent thinkers live in a two-story or bipolar existence, right? In their professional work, they adopt a reductionistic philosophy that regards people as essentially nothing or unable to do anything. But when they leave their laboratories and go home for the day, they have to switch to a contrary paradigm in order to treat people justly and humanely, to avoid life that is, as you mentioned, intolerable.
Yeah.
Right? So even the great Einstein, she tells us, was caught in the same dilemma. On the one hand, he writes, human beings in their thinking, feeling, and acting are not free. Einstein are not free, but are as causally bound as the stars in their motions. We're
we're planetary bodies. You could land rovers on us. We are so conditioned to just be non willing entities.
Yeah, unable to will.
Yeah, we are specks of dust on a planet orbiting, and so we are just following the motion of our previous cause and effects.
Yeah. But she says, on the other hand, he says, I'm compelled to act as if free will exists, because if I want to live in a civilized society, I must act responsibly. Wow, right?
Yeah.
So notice she says Einstein's phrase "as if" is the giveaway, right? That he's talking about an irrational leap of faith. And she notes that the source of this phrase is in the writings of another German, Immanuel Kant, right? On the one hand, Kant thought that science led to the conclusion that humans are elements in a vast machine operating, by the laws of physics. But on the other hand, he said, to salvage morality, we must act as if we were free, right? And to ratify our moral standards, we must act as if God exists. This is a really interesting argument. So Kant here is suggesting that we have to act as if God exists in order to be moral creatures.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing? So he says, for instance, justice. Well, justice doesn't exist. Ultimate justice doesn't exist in this world.
Right. Yeah.
There are lots of people that get away with stuff, right? And so there must be an afterlife, or at least we have to act like there's an afterlife where somebody is going to be ultimately judged. But in order to be ultimately judged, you have to have a judge who is who knows all the facts, who's all knowing. Otherwise, they could be judged in error, and that's not justice, right? And you have to have a judge who is good, so that they can be judged correctly and rightly according to a moral standard, right? And finally, in order for justice to exist, you have to have a judge who is able to back up the judgment that they adhere to, right? In other words, they have to have the power in order to to apply the justice. So what you have is an afterlife. You have an all-knowing, all-good, all-powerful judge. What does that sound like to you?
A work of fiction, obviously. Yeah. But and again, like these are ideals that have fostered the up until now the modern Western world, and it seems like it's the whole have your cake and eat it too. It's the communist role of once the capitalists come in, those evil capitalists, and they build society. Then we come in and take, and then we bleed it dry until that wasn't real socialism, right. And so it's like, well, right, because you completely upended everything, and now you want to say that this is the opposite. And along the lines of justice, we have this ideal of we'd rather 1,000 guilty men be set free than an innocent man be sent off to pay for a crime he didn't commit. I mean that right there, within it is the scope of the idea of what you're saying is that there's justice that's meted out. Yes, not here in this world, but in the next. And so, yes, the guilty men will always pay the penalty for their actions, always, in some capacity. But then if an innocent person pays inappropriately in this life, they've had their life stolen from them that didn't need to be, and so that's how careful we should be within the meting out of justice. Yeah. And so that's a Christian ideal.
Yeah, they're borrowing from Christianity.
And so why should we do that
from
now?
Our worldview.
It seems like now we should just hang them high, all of them, because if a guilty person goes unscathed, then they could get away with it. So it's best to plant evidence and do all these nasty things that we find abhorrent. But that's not how
right. Well, if you don't believe that there's going to be ultimate justice at the end of something, right, and this person is about to get free, and you are committed somehow that there must be justice, then what do? Right? You have to kind of fake it. She says here that in Kant's view, it's impossible to know whether these theological teachings are true. Right, so he says we really don't know. But to encourage moral behavior, he says we must live as if they were true. The phrase "as if" then signals a concept that has been moved to the upper story. Right, so here morality is moved. We have to live as if these moral concepts are true. These theological concepts are true, and so he puts them in the upper story. Right, because it's impossible to know, but we still have to live as if they are true, right? And so this concept is if. So instead of giving up the worldview because of these types of situations, right, in the face of contrary facts and that sort of thing, she says that folks that believe like this endure a severe mental schizophrenia.
Right. On one hand, you want to say, we are all robots, and then on the other side you say, whoa, you can't live like robots.
Yeah.
Life will be bad for me, at least me.
Yeah.
And then
I want to live in a civilized world.
Yeah. So can you program yourselves not to be robots then? Yeah. So she goes on to say that we still live in the shadow of Kant, and that's clearly the case. Computer scientist Eric Baum argues that the mind is essentially a computer program produced by evolutionary process. Thus, free will is an illusion. The logical argument is airtight, he insists. And then he adds, but who really cares for all practical purposes? It's much more reasonable and practical for my genes to build me believing in free will and for me to act and think as if I have free will. It's a useful fiction. Well, that's nice. Evolutionary process has provided us incorrect data just so that we survive. And so there are things like math and logic. Those things can be just illusions as well, right? Necessary fictions, useful fictions. So we can't really know anything about the world.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the next chapter too. Free will is a very useful theory for describing human behavior rights, yet it is still wrong. To be precise, it's not even wrong because it cannot be given any logical interpretation, at least not within his worldview. And Baum concludes that the belief is simply mystical. Oh, wow. That sounds very scientific. That sounds very quantitatable and qualifiable. One group of thinkers even have been labeled Mysterians, argue that human intelligence is simply not equipped to solve the mystery of consciousness, that it evolved to solve purely practical problems like obtaining food and making tools. Yeah, because having an idea of what is truth and what is what does Socrates say? What is the highest ideal that we can ascribe to? Yep, those are only for finding foods and making tools.
Of course, there's all kinds of organisms that we would suggest aren't conscious that find food and
make tools. Yeah, ravens they put little pebbles in to make the water level go up and find water.
Well, especially finding food, right? Bacteria finds food, right? Viruses find food, right? So, yeah.
A representative of this group, Colin McGinn, writes, consciousness must have evolved from matter somehow, but nothing we could contrive or imagine seems to offer the faintest hope for explanation. We just don't have the faculties of comprehension that would enable us to remove the sense of mystery. Francis Schaeffer, of course, the great Francis Schaeffer in The God Who Is There, observes that every worldview containing a two-story dualism leads ultimately to mysticism. Hey, look at that. Yeah. They'll even take it. He called it,
40 years before?
He called his shot. He pointed out over the fence. Yeah. He swung. Yeah. And by pure practical robotic adherence, it went in that direction.
50 years, 60 years before it happened, or before they got there, Schaeffer, it's kind of like that old saw where the philosopher does everything, climbs the mountain, huffs and puffs, finally gets up to the top, and he finds that it's full of theologians. Right?
So the mysticism in the sense that adherents must affirm truths that their own worldview cannot rationally explain. You have to call it useful fiction. You have to call it a mystery. Yet when Christians have this idea of revealed will and prescribed will, we say that there are things that are prescribed to us that we should do, but there are actions that happen in the world that we don't have an understanding to why God allows it, but we have to be we should be certain in the fact that God is good and a just judge and everything like that. So that there's a mystery aspect to it. Then that's you wanting to save your double-minded philosophy of this God. But when they do it, it's fine because it's just a product of evolution, and they're good.
Yeah, it's okay for them.
Yeah,
right? Because they're the elites.
Yeah, they're the scientists.
This next section she's entitled Darwinian Psychopaths. Right? She says Romans 1 says that God gives people up. So that's kind of what we were mentioning a bit ago. To pursue their idols ever further, increasing the gap between what they profess and what they practice. Right? So they profess something like no free will, but they practice we do have free will, and they hold people morally responsible
and we
for
hope
what
other
they do.
people have free will.
Yeah, right? She says we can picture worldviews falling along a continuum. The more consistently people work out the logic of their worldviews, the more reductionistic the result will be.
Sure.
The wider the gap and the further it leaps into irrational mysticism. The choice facing them becomes ever clearer. Will they follow the evidence of general revelation, right? Or will they cling to their theories in the face of the evidence, right? In other words, will they continue to bash their nose against the wall, right?
Right.
So she wants us to follow a series of examples. She'll start here with Slenderman, and she wants us to see where his philosophy ends, right? Where it ends. So as a Darwinist and a materialist, he acknowledges that his reductionist view of humans as essentially robots is contrary to ordinary experience. No duh, right?
Right.
It is alien, quote, alien and often repugnant from any source of human perspective. So gesturing toward his own daughter, so now it gets personal, right? Slenderman writes, at an important and irrevocable level, the idea of my daughter as merely a complex robot carrying my genes into the next generation is both bizarre and repugnant to me, right? As it ought to be, right?
Yeah.
Such a reductionistic view, Nancy Pearcey tells us, inspires in us a kind of emotional resistance and even revulsion. Yeah. So Slenderman is revulsed at the outcome of his worldview.
Right. He looks at his daughter and says the purpose of his life is just to carry on his genes. Yeah. That's the biggest one. So he looks at his daughter and goes, I've made it. There's my daughter. She's alive. Success. I've succeeded in life. That's all she is just a product of it's his blue ribbon.
A gene carrying machine.
And then to go further and say, her only purpose is to continue to carry my genes, and so she's just a sack of meat to father or to birth a child and continue the at least only half of his or a quarter of his
and he
his
recognizes
DNA.
that's bizarre and repugnant, right? I mean, that's it's revolting, to think about that. Indeed, she says, he writes, if you do not feel that revulsion, something is wrong with you. Right?
Well, he's just not making this easy at all.
He says there may well be individuals who lack this sense and who can quite easily and thoroughly conceive of themselves and other people in purely instrumental, mechanistic terms, but we label such people psychopaths. And quite rightly try to identify them and put them away somewhere to protect the rest of us from the folks that attempt to live out what he says we should believe, or what he says is the case, right? So Nancy Pearcey tells us, what can we say when someone urges us to adopt a view of humanity that he himself admits is bizarre and repugnant, a view that ought to inspire revulsion, a view so dangerous that when acted upon it would be justifiable for us to label people as sociopaths and lock them up, right? She says there's a severe clash between what his Darwinian materialism tells him in the downstairs, this is what's true, right, and what his lived experience tells him in the upstairs. And I don't really believe that, I don't really believe this, but I got to live that way. So which one will he accept as true? Right.
People are computers, and so their actions, you should arrest them and hold them accountable and punish them based on their choices from a system that is cold, hard facts and logic. Yeah, and so we don't do that. We don't do that with computers.
Yeah, really.
The nuclear missile launches prematurely, and we go, "Oh, it's got a bug." Yeah. but we don't say it made a moral action. It's
That's
wrong.
Right. That's right.
It needs to be punished.
That's right.
And no more RAM for you. Well, no, that's not at all what we do.
We're going to unplug you, buddy.
Yeah.
Right. She says. So she says to describe this kind of clash that we see here. She thinks maybe cognitive dissonance may be too tame of a word. And she says this is a searing contradiction, right? Paul writes that those who build their lives on idols become futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts are darkened. Romans 1:21. And so, she says the Greek word for futile here means unproductive, ineffective, failing to achieve its purpose. As this example clearly shows, idol-based worldviews do not produce what a philosophy of life is meant to give us. And what's that? A coherent, logically satisfying worldview that makes sense of all of life. Right?
Everything has to fit in the box.
Yeah. And so she says, no wonder Paul writes that those who reject the Creator are without excuse. The phrase means without a defense. Right? It's kind of it's using that word that we get apologetics from, right? It originally referred to a legal defense in a courtroom. So these people are without excuse because they're banging their nose up against a wall of reality, and they're attempting to tell us that doesn't exist, right? So the strength of her approach, she reminds us, is that it shows why worldviews fail on their own terms. On their own terms. This is what you say the way the world is, and yet you can't live consistently like that, and you have to pretend that something else is the case in order to be able to live out in the world.
Right. It's an illusion. It only appears that way.
Yeah.
You can't live despite the initial belief. All those things.
Right. And so what we do then is we kind of show them on their own terms, where their worldview leads us in terms of how it relates to the real world. She says it's rarely persuasive to criticize other views from within your own perspective. All that really shows is that those other views disagree with you. Instead, you must step imaginatively inside other perspectives to show from within why they lack explanatory power.
Right. So a window versus a mirror. So you're on the side of the living room. You're pointing out into the world that they are claiming is there, and you're showing them through the window. Here's your implications. This is what you want. This is your explanatory power, and hopefully they'll either say yes, and then you can call them a psychopath, which they then call themselves.
Right.
Or what you do then is you hold up the mirror to them and say, can you then live within your own means? Does the system that you would adhere to kind of self-implode? So that's the next principle that we'll get to.
Right. So should we?
I mean, we're going to have to. Yeah.
So we're going along here, and so I think we're going to have to finish this.
The next episode will be a little bit short, just to get through the rest of it, and this one went a little long. Yeah, who knows? I'm doing all the talking. No. So next week we'll have the conclusion of this chapter, and then after that, we got something else in mind. So we're going to take another pause within our book. Catch your breath. Don't do 4 more parts like we did the previous chapter, but it'll be within the same vein as this. So join us next time, finish up the chapter, and then go from there.
See you next time.